Ouverture. Living in a topsy-turvy world. In his Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel uses the term die verkehrte Welt, usually translated into English as topsy-turvy world, to designate the madness of the social reality of his time. Quote, an example of topsy-turvy occurs when your carefully made plans got messed up at the last minute and everyone is running every which way with no idea where to go. End of quote. Does this sentence from yourdictionary.com entry for topsy-turvy not encapsulate perfectly the basic reversal in a Hegelian dialectical process, in the course of which even the best made projects turn into their opposite? A dream of freedom into terror, morality into hypocrisy, excessive wealth into poverty of the majority? Back in 1576, Thomas Rogers wrote in his A Philosophical Discourse entitled The Anatomy of the Mind, quote, devilish it is to destroy a city, but more than devilish to avert cities, to betray countries, to cause servants to kill their masters, parents their children, children their parents, wives their husbands, and to turn all things topsy-turvy. End of quote. Three basic relations of domination, master over servants, parents over children, husbands over wives, are here turned around, or rather, inside out. Is this not a succinct formula of Hegel's thought? So, is the present book yet another one on Hegel? In order to explain the logic of denial, Verneinung, Freud evokes a remark made by one of his patients. You ask who that woman in my dream can be. Whoever she is, it's not my mother. Freud's reaction, which has since become proverbial, is, the question is settled then. We can be sure it is indeed his mother. I can say exactly the same about this book of mine. Whatever this book is about, it's not about Hegel. And this is not a Freudian denial, but literally true. Yes, Hegel is ever present in it. Even when he is not directly mentioned, he lurks in the background. But the topic of the book is exactly what its title says. It's about how the paradoxes of surplus enjoyment sustain the topsy-turviness of our time. From Catastrophe to Apocalypse. And back. In an ideological space, different stances get connected into what Ernest Laclau called a chain of equivalences. For example, extreme right-wing conspiracy theories about the COVID-19 pandemic get combined with New Age spirituality. Melissa Ryan Lively's focus on wellness, natural health, organic food, yoga, Ayurvedic healing, meditation, etc. led her into a violent rejection of vaccines as a source of dangerous contamination. Today, this process is palpable all around us. We live in a weird moment where multiple catastrophes, pandemic, global warming, social tensions, the prospect of full digital control over our thinking, compete for primacy, not just quantitatively, but also in the sense of which of them will count as the quilting point, Lacan's point de capiton, which totalizes all others. Today, the main candidate in the public discourse is global warming, while lately the antagonism which, in our part of the world at least, appears as the crucial one, is that between partisans of vaccination and vaccine skeptics. The problem here is that, for COVID skeptics, the main catastrophe today is the fake vision of the pandemic catastrophe itself, which is manipulated by those in power to strengthen social control and economic exploitation. If one takes a closer look at how the struggle against vaccination condenses other struggles, struggle against state control, struggle against science, struggle against corporate economic exploitation, struggle for the defense of our way of life, it becomes clear that this key role of the struggle against vaccination is the outcome of an ideological mystification, in some aspects even similar to anti-Semitism. In the same way that anti-Semitism is a displaced, mystified form of anti-capitalism, the struggle against vaccination is also a displaced, mystified form of class struggle against those in power. To find a way in this mess, we should perhaps mobilize the distinction between apocalypse and catastrophe, reserving the term catastrophe for what Anders called naked apocalypse. Apocalypse, and uncovering in ancient Greek, is a disclosure or revelation of knowledge. In religious speech, what apocalypse discloses is something hidden, the ultimate truth we are blind to in our ordinary lives. Today we commonly refer to any larger scale catastrophic event or chain of detrimental events to humanity or nature as apocalyptic. Although it is easy to imagine the apocalypse disclosure without the apocalypse catastrophe, say a religious revelation, and the apocalypse catastrophe without the apocalypse disclosure, say an earthquake destroying an entire continent, there is an inner link between the two dimensions. When we think that we confront some higher and hitherto hidden truth, this truth is so different from our common opinions that it has to shatter our world, and vice versa. Every catastrophic event, even if purely natural, reveals something ignored in our normal existence, places us face to face with an oppressed truth. In his essay, Apocalypse Without Kingdom, Anders introduced the concept of naked apocalypse. The apocalypse that consists of mere downfall, which doesn't represent the opening of a new positive state of affairs of the kingdom. Anders' idea was that a nuclear catastrophe would be precisely such a naked apocalypse. No new kingdom will arise out of it, just the obliteration of ourselves and our world. And the question we should ask today is, what kind of apocalypse is announced in the plurality of catastrophes that today pose a threat to all of us? What if apocalypse in the full sense of the term, which includes the disclosure of hitherto invisible truth, never happens? What if truth is something that is constructed afterwards, as an attempt to make sense of the catastrophe? Some would argue that the disintegration of communist regimes in Eastern Europe in the 90s was an authentic apocalypse. It brought out the truth that socialism doesn't work, that liberal democracy is the finally discovered best possible socio-economic system. But this Fukuyama dream of the end of history ended with a rude awakening a decade later, on September 11th, so that we live today in an era that is best characterized as the end of the end. The circle is closed. We passed from catastrophe to apocalypse, and then back to catastrophe. We hear again and again that we are at the end of history, but this end just drags on and even brings its own enjoyment. Our usual notion of catastrophe is that it takes place when the intrusion of some brutal event, earthquake, war, ruins the symbolic fiction which is our reality. But perhaps there is no less a catastrophe when reality remains as it is, and just the symbolic fiction that sustains our approach to reality dissolves. Let's take the case of sexuality, since nowhere do fictions play a more crucial role than in sexuality. In an interesting comment on the role of consent in sexual relations, Eva Wiseman refers to, quote, a moment in The Butterfly Effect, John Ronson's podcast series about internet porn. On the set of a porn film, an actor lost his erection mid-scene, and to coax it back, he turned away from the woman naked below him, grabbed his phone, and searched Pornhub, which struck me as vaguely apocalyptic, end of quote. Note the word apocalypse here. Wiseman concludes, quote, something is rotten in the state of sex, end of quote. I agree, but I would add the lesson of psychoanalysis. Human sexuality is in itself perverted, exposed to sadomasochist reversals and specifically to the mixture of reality and fantasy. Even when I am alone with my partner, my sexual interaction with him/her is inextricably intertwined with my fantasies, i.e., every sexual interaction is potentially structured like masturbation with a real partner. I use the flesh and body of my partner as a prop to realize and act my fantasies. We cannot reduce this gap between the bodily reality of my partner and the universe of fantasies to a distortion opened up by patriarchy and social domination or exploitation. The gap is there from the very beginning. So I quite understand the actor who, in order to regain an erection, searched Pornhub. He was looking for a phantasmatic support for his performance. The rather sad conclusion we are forced to draw from all this is that a catastrophe is not something awaiting us in the future, something that can be avoided with a well thought out strategy. Catastrophe in not only its basic ontological sense, is something that always already happened, and we, the surviving humans, are what remains. At all levels, even in the most empirical sense. Do the immense reserves of oil and coal, until now our most important source of energy, not bear witness to immense catastrophes that took place on our Earth before the rise of humankind? Our normality is, by definition, post-apocalyptic. This brings us back to our main point. Apart from a couple of rational optimists, most of us agree that we, all of us, humanity, are caught in a multiple crisis. Pandemic, global warming, social protests. We are entering a new era, and signs that we are doing so abound. This prospect of a war over access to the waters of the Nile is perhaps a model of wars to come. From the standpoint of nation-state sovereignty, Ethiopia is justified in reserving for itself as much as it wants or needs. But if it takes too much of it, this can threaten the very survival of Egypt, which is reliant on the Nile. There is no abstract solution to this problem. There has to be a negotiated compromise from a global perspective. Now, let's jump to a recent act of state terrorism. Belarus forcing a Ryanair plane, which was on its way from Athens to Vilnius, to land in order to get hold of Roman Protasevich, a Belarus dissident. While unambiguously condemning this act of terror, one should remember that Austria did exactly the same thing, landing a flight crossing its airspace, the plane of the Bolivian president Evo Morales. This was done on the order of the US, which suspected Edward Snowden was on that plane, trying to get from Russia to Latin America. What do the two events have in common? They both exemplify a new type of conflict, which will increasingly characterize our global era. The collision of state sovereignty and the interests of larger communities. Although capitalism nourishes itself from crises, using them to reappear stronger than ever, there is a growing suspicion that this time the well-tested formula will not work. The focus of this book is not different crises as such, but how we fight them and reproduce them, sometimes doing both things in one and the same move. What I try to achieve is not just to analyze the mess we are in, but simultaneously to deploy how most of the critiques and protests against global capitalism effectively function as its ideological supplement and do not really question its basic premises. To see how this is possible, one needs to analyze ideology, not as an abstract system of principles, but as a material force which structures our actual life. What this further necessitates is that we mobilize the complex apparatus of psychoanalytic theory, which brings out the libidinal investments that regulate our daily lives.